So this week I thought it would be good to talk about striking competitions, mainly because today would have been the day of the National 12 Bell Striking Contest final, which was to be held in Sheffield. So always a good day out, and if you've not been to a 12 Bell final before, then I'd encourage you to do so. You don't need to be a 12 Bell ringer to enjoy a day with lots of beer and good company and good ringing. I'd suggest. I thought I'd start with a photograph. This is a photograph from last year's 12 Bell final in Exeter, and in the middle of the photo is Lewisham District alumnus Matt Helling holding up the Taylor Trophy after Exeter's emphatic win in the 12 Bell final last year. Sadly, of course, 12 Bell final can't happen this year, but if you're missing it, there's a broadcast this afternoon called Not the 12 Bell Live, which I'd recommend, I think starting at 1 o'clock this afternoon. So do check that out if you're interested in that. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about three things so that there's something for everyone here. I'll say a few things about entering striking competitions, a little bit about hosting, if you were thinking of hosting a local or bigger striking competition, and I'll talk for a while at the end about judging striking competitions. A few things on that, because we only have 40 minutes. I won't be able to say everything there is to say about judging. I'll try to cover the most important things, or what I see as the most important things. But I'll also refer you to lots of resources to find out more. So if you are interested in that particular area, judging striking competitions, there's quite a lot of stuff online and in books and in videos about judging that you can check out to find out more. We're not going to do any kind of practice listening for judging. I think that would take a bit too much time. But we'll talk about, as I say, some of the most important parts of judging at the end of the talk. So entering a competition, entering a striking competition, and this is whether your band might never have entered a competition before, or you might enter them all the time, in which case some of this would be pretty familiar, I'd have thought. But if you haven't entered a competition before as a band, I'd really encourage you to do so. I think it's an interesting trend at the moment that big competitions, things like the National 12 Bell and all of the regional 12 Bell competitions that it's kind of sparked, so like the London 12 Bell, Northwest, Southwest 12 Bell. Those competitions are really thriving, and participation in those is growing, I think, as a general trend. While local district 6 bells, 8 bells association competitions perhaps don't have as many teams, certainly in the Lewisham district, that's our experience, don't have as many teams entering as they used to. And so I think it's worth emphasizing here that entering striking competitions is really useful. It's useful for your band, both in terms of giving a real focus on the quality of striking that you're producing, but also in terms of band kind of cohesion and community. And it's actually, for ringers who are learners, entering their first competition, I think, is a really big moment and a really nice thing to be asked to do and to be asked into. So it's really worth doing. And if you haven't, as a band, entered a competition recently, I think when striking competitions start up again, it's really worth thinking about doing it. If you don't quite have enough ringers, then see if the rules allow you to maybe team up with another band or get some sort of extra outside help in. Yeah, it's really worth doing. A few other things to think about with entering a competition. Try to, I'd suggest, think a bit about how serious the competition is, I suppose. So if it's something where you're thinking, oh, we really want to win, then you might approach how you choose your band members, what you choose to ring, a bit differently to if it's like, well, actually the main purpose of us entering this competition is more around developing the band. So think a bit about like what you're entering it for, and that will affect perhaps your choice of who you have in the band and what you choose to ring as a method. I'd suggest taking some time to look carefully at the rules of the competition. An example of falling foul of this is in the competition that is illustrated in this photograph. Here is me in 2009 when I was at university, and we entered the Guild of Devonshire Ringers 8-bell competition as a sort of student band. And immediately before starting, I asked one of the other ringers, I said, the rounds at the start aren't marked for this competition, are they? And he went, oh, no, it's fine. We can ring as many rounds as we want, really loudly to everyone in the tower. So when we started, I kind of gave it a lot of rounds at the start to settle the ringing, which I'd generally recommend as a thing to do before you start when you're entering a competition. Lots and lots of rounds, and it took us a while to settle down. And then we rang quite a decent test piece, finished, and then awaited the results. And when we got to the results, the bit of feedback that we got was this band rang rounds for a long time at the start. And this did pick up a large number of faults. And it turned out that the person who said, oh, no, it's fine, you can ring as many rounds as you want to, knew that the rounds were marked, but didn't want anyone to get stressed about ringing rounds at the beginning. And if I'd read the rules properly, I would have known that the rounds were marked at the start, and we wouldn't have fallen into this mistake. Probably ended up a little bit lower in the ranking than we could have done otherwise. So read the rules carefully, just in case there are any odd requirements, and rules around like how long you have to ring for, or how many call changes you have to call. Some competitions have those sorts of rules that you can often easily fall foul of, that sort of thing. Have a look at the rules carefully. If you've got a choice of method, and you won't always have a choice of method of what you ring, think a bit about what it's going to be and make sure that there's a balance between, reflecting the ability of your band, really. I think it's always a little frustrating, perhaps, when bands that can ring some quite complicated methods choose to ring something very simple, simply in order to win a striking competition. So think about, you want a balance between you're going to be able to ring this thing, strike this method well, but you don't want to take the mick in terms of what you've chosen to ring compared to the capability of your band. I think practice is really important, taking time to practice beforehand, perhaps just at your practice night, or if you're taking it really seriously, you might want to visit some comparable towers to the place where the competition is taking place. And in your when you're actually entering the competition, you'll probably have some time on the day before your test piece to practice on the bells. Try to use that time wisely and think about whether you want to maybe practice the first couple of leads of the method or do something different. Different bands do all sorts of weird and wonderful exercises, certainly at the 12-bell, as part of their practice piece, in order to give them what they think will be a best possible advantage when it comes to the actual test piece. If you're a ringer who's been invited to ring in your first striking competition when they start up again, I just advise listening really carefully, firstly to your bell, but also to the advice you're getting from the other ringers and what they're suggesting, either during the test piece, though I think it's probably best not to say too much during the test piece in terms of striking amendments unless they're really egregious errors, but also in the practice beforehand. So that's kind of entering. Read the rules carefully. There might be some odd requirements. Have a practice beforehand. Don't take it too seriously. There's a balance there. Use the practice time wisely and think a bit about what you ring and about band placement. Try to ask a range of different people and abilities within your band. I think that's really useful and helpful, and getting new people into striking competition bands, I think, is really important. A few quick things about hosting a striking competition. If you've been asked to host a striking competition, I think it's well worth doing. It's a really nice thing to be able to do as a tower. You'll want to think about a few of these things. You might want to consider what sort of refreshments you'll offer. If it's an all-day thing, then some sort of food, maybe even beer, or certainly working out a local pub that you can recommend to people is a good idea. Having a clear idea of where people need to go is a good plan. So, like how to get into the tower, how to get up the tower, you might want a steward to take people into and up the tower. You'll need somewhere to hold the draw, so that will happen at the start of a striking competition. Somebody draws out the order that the team's going to ring out of a hat. You'll need somewhere to do that, probably in the church. You need to talk to the vicar, maybe get them to come and do the draw for you. It might be quite nice. And you'll need also a similar venue for holding the results at the end of the day. You'll need to make sure your bells are in reasonable nick and a rope's not going to break halfway through, or a stay or anything like that. And finding somewhere for the judge. Now, when we'll talk about judging in a moment, I think it's the location of the judge is quite an important thing to get right. So you don't want them to be somewhere where they can see bands entering and leaving the tower, because it's still probably rightly thought that the judge knowing who's ringing isn't really best practice, because it will either consciously or subconsciously affect their judgment. So you want them out of the way where they're not going to be sort of seeing ringers, not going to be hearing ringers, so there's not too much background noise of chatter of ringers gossiping away in the corner somewhere. And yeah, somewhere where they've got a clear sound from the bells that's not going to be disturbed by like a busy main road or sirens going past or aircraft flying overhead or anything like that, if you can help it. So think a bit about the location of the judge, and also think about the judge's needs, so providing them with tea, cake, that sort of thing. Depending on the length of the competition, this will vary a bit, but having somebody whose job it is to sort of look after the judge is probably quite a nice thing to do as well. So that's sort of hosting, having clear directions for where people need to go, making sure you've got a venue for the draw and for the results, and finding somewhere comfortable for the judge where they've got a clear sound of the bells, undisturbed by background noise, and making sure that they're sort of well looked after. Okay, and the final sort of section of this trilogy of things about striking competitions is around judging. There is a lot to say about judging, and certainly more than I can fit into the next sort of 20 minutes of this talk. So I'm going to show you some resources at the end that you can use, as I say, to look at this a bit further. But yeah, well, I'll say a few kind of main things about judging from the experience that I've had of it so far. The first thing I think it's important to recognise, if you're thinking about having a go at judging a competition, if you get invited to do that at some point, it's a complex business. There is a lot to it. It's a complicated role. There are lots of things that you're having to do at once, as we'll see in a moment. And it's actually, I think it's important that judges take the responsibility of judging quite seriously. That doesn't mean that you should be really scared and stressed about doing it for the first time, but it is a responsibility. Bands put quite a lot of time and effort into preparing for striking competitions, particularly big ones like the 12 part. And so it really is up to judges to take that seriously and think, well, bands have prepared for this, they've put lots of time into this, I've got to do my very best to kind of perform the following role correctly. First bit of that role is to try your very best to get the right result, so to have the teams in the right order in that competition. So you've got your winner, and you know who it is, and you're confident about which team has won, and you're confident about the ranking of the bands through the rest of the competition. Obviously, if you're judging something where there's just two teams and it's like a face-off between two local towers, that's easier to do than a competition where you might have 8, 9, or 10 teams or more, as we'll see in a moment. So getting the result right is part of the role, obviously. And also providing helpful feedback to bands, I think, is a really important part of the role as well. And those comments that you deliver to bands before giving the final result, I think, can be really very helpful for teams. Some people are like, why don't they just get on with the results? But I do think that the feedback is a really useful thing. So because of this role that involves getting the right order and providing helpful feedback and balancing those things. Because of this complex role, when you're listening to each individual test piece of the ringing, you're sort of having to do lots of different things. On a what I'd call the sort of macro level, big level of the whole touch, you're sort of thinking about big trends across the whole piece. So how different bells are working together, how well the back bells are ringing, the front bells, what the rhythm is like across the whole piece, what's the general quality of the leading hand stroke gap. Are there any things that seem to be causing problems in the method? Are bands finding the dodging harder than the hunting, or that sort of thing? So there's the kind of overall level of the whole touch, and the sort of macro level of that. And then on a micro level, where you're thinking about the faults, you're generating that overall score for the band. You're sort of thinking about each individual row in quite a lot of detail, the gaps, the clips where they're happening. You're trying to mark faults as you're doing this, but also thinking, as I'm saying, about that big level of the touch as well. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot to balance there. And obviously, the first kind of priority, if you're marking faults, so using the approach where you're marking faults, we'll talk about that a bit in a moment. Your first priority is to keep marking those faults accurately. But at the same time, you're having to think about things that you can use to give helpful feedback as well. So let's drill down a bit more into this process and what it would involve. So most striking competitions currently are marked using fault marking. That's different to some competitions where a computer program called, let's call it the strikeometer, is used, and the computer does the fault marking, and the human judges focus more on that second thing, that first thing I mentioned, rather, the kind of macro level of the touch. But most competitions are marked using fault marking. So I'll talk about that rather than talking about the technology that's used in the 12 bell. There's lots available online talking about the strikeometer. So you can find out more about that kind of independently. But in terms of fault marking, let's think about like what it is and how it works. So effectively, what you do when you're marking faults is for each row, you will have, ideally, you'll have a judging sheet, and you'll either have, if it's a competition where bands can just choose what they ring, you'll probably have it in a sort of generic format like this. So just rounds and then a box next to it, a fault box next to it. And bands will be ringing a method, but because you don't know necessarily what that's going to be, you just have to have it like that. I think if you can, if there's a set method or a set touch for the competition, it's very helpful to have a judging sheet more like this one in this photograph, where you have the changes written out, because that really helps speed up the process of identifying individual bells or areas where there might be a need for improvement or general trends, because actually when you're listening to ringing, it's easier to spot where individual bells are if you can see it on a piece of paper in front of you. So most competitions, generally, I think bands tend to be free to choose what they want to ring. So you'll probably have a judging sheet a bit like this for 8 bells, or obviously similar for 6 bells, with boxes down the side for marking the faults. Now, let's think a bit about what that actually involves. So for each row, you're going to say if it's perfect, then that's 0. There are no faults. That's faultless row. Actually, most rows aren't faultless. I tend to find there's usually something that isn't absolutely perfect about that row. So then you need, because you're going to have a range of different levels of faultiness to the row, you're going to want a range of different marking options. I'd tend to use sort of up to 4 per row, but some people might use fewer, might just have 1 fault, or they might have 1 fault and a half fault, or a quarter fault. There are all sorts of different ways of doing it, and you sort of evolve your own system, really. But you assign, so say, 0 faults for a perfect row, 1 fault for a little blemish, a clip or a gap, and then you kind of build it up from there. So maybe 2 faults if there are 2 clips or gaps, or maybe something that's just a little bit worse, a little bit bigger gap, or more like a crunch, perhaps. Then 3 faults if it's really got quite a few things wrong with it, so several clips, gaps, or some very big problems, and then maybe 4 if it's what you might call a total write-off. This is where it's worth just pausing for a moment to say that what you say in the judging room between judges should stay in the judging room. If you're like, that was rubbish after a piece, that shouldn't make its way into the comments that you're giving to bands a bit later on. Yeah, and I'd be quite, firm on that point, I'd suggest. So you're going to assign some faults to it. So people, as I say, will evolve their own system. I tend to be between 1 and 4. And you need to do that through the whole piece. It's quite intense because actually by the time you've put the faults in the box, you're on to the next row. So you're having to kind of mark stuff on the paper and listen to the next row and keep going. And so it's really intense, and judging is quite a tiring experience. And then when you get to the end, you'll want to add them up for that team. Now, there's a few things to say about this. When the test piece that a band is ringing comes to an end, it's worth, before you start adding up your faults, just taking a moment to think, if you're judging on your own, think about how good was that piece overall, and to make some notes on those big issues that I was talking about, the macro level of the whole touch. Make some notes, because otherwise, by the time you get to writing your comments and finalizing your comments at the end, you'll have forgotten what the first team was like, actually, and a judging sheet with faults doesn't give you a lot of information unless you make some notes. So make notes as soon as the team finishes. If you're judging as part of a team, and I'd encourage that in general, if you can, unless it's a really small competition, it's well worth getting a helper, at least one helper, to help you with the judging. Is discuss the band, how that you felt that went, and make some notes. But don't, at that stage, discuss your kind of fault total. Then add them up, and then you want to think a bit about the fact that you don't want the judges to sort of influence each other's marking over the future, over the rest of the day. We'll talk a bit more about this in a moment, but I think it's really important that judges stay as consistent as they possibly can within themselves in their own process of fault marking through the whole day. We'll see why that's important in a moment. And so that's why I think, it's important to not talk too much about your fault totals with your fellow judges as you're going. I think it's, or certainly not in a way that's going to influence what they do in the next band, because you need to try to maintain that consistency, which is really hard to do, but is very important. So you'll assign these faults to each row, and then you'll add them up. That takes time. You'll tend to find that once you've marked team 1, team 2 will start their practice piece, and you'll have 10, 15 minutes maybe to add up the previous team's scores, make some notes, talk a bit about how that band did, have a sip of your cup of tea, maybe eat a piece of cake if you're lucky, and then you're into marking the next team. So it's quite an intense experience. Thinking a bit about like how you can get ready to do this and ready to mark faults. One thing I'd encourage you to do is, there's lots of videos of ringing online on YouTube. Central Council just recently finished a competition for finding excellent ringing last month. There's lots of stuff online that I'd encourage you to spend time listening to, maybe pick 2 or 3 pieces and then try marking them. And then maybe mix up the order, try marking them again, see if you get the same result. That sort of honing of the judging is really useful in preparing and practicing in advance. Let's think a bit more about what you'd actually need for the day. So we've talked a bit about fault marking. We've talked about the big level of the touch, the small detail level of the touch as well. Let's think about practicalities for a moment. So you'll want to take lots of pencils. You'll want to take judging sheets. As I said earlier, if you can get judging sheets where you've got the touch written out, that's quite helpful. But if you can't, don't worry too much. You'll want to take a notepad, probably, to write some comments. If it's a big competition with lots of teams, it's worth maybe taking a laptop to write the comments and type things up as you go, because it's a lot quicker. It's worth thinking about, hopefully, the team or the band hosting the competition will have lots of food available, lots of refreshments to give to the judge, but they might not. So I'd suggest taking plenty of water, taking some other supplies. A friend of mine in Exeter, when we judge together, tends to favour these Marks and Spencer's very chocolatey biscuits. So taking supplies with you is useful. As I said, having a friend to come and judge with you is helpful as well. Finding out in advance what the competition is like, by which I mean what are the rules, because judges sometimes, well, generally have to be the arbiters of things like whether the band started at the right time and rang for the right length of time and rang the right sort of thing. So you have to be familiar with what the rules say about those requirements. You have to be familiar with what the format of the results is supposed to be, so how you're going to be giving the results, how those will work. You'll want to think about, the kind of, as I said, the sort of seriousness of the competitions. So, what kind of feedback the bands will be expecting. And the format for the results. So how are you going to be expected to deliver the results? What sort of order of results are you expected to give? That sort of thing. When you're marking faults, when you're actually into the detail of the judging, main advice is just to listen carefully. You'll have hopefully done some practice at marking faults, so you've had a go at this already. But listen really carefully, work on that. It's very hard to remain consistent through a whole day's competition for several reasons. Firstly, it's tiring. Judging is tiring, and so by the end of the day, you're a bit tired. It's hard to remain really consistent in fault marking. I personally, the approach I take is to be as harsh as possible and just to kind of keep that up all the way through the day. But different people will do it in different ways. But it's definitely hard to remain consistent. One of the things that's really worth looking out for, which was identified in a series of articles that Liz Orme and Katrina Shearer wrote for the Ringing World at the end of 2018, where they used data from the National 12-Bell competition to look at various different trends in those results. And they found evidence before the strichometer was used in the 12-bell of a thing known as serial order effect, which is a known phenomenon in things like, well, in sports and other things which are judged, which is where the previous piece that was judged affects the judging of future pieces, and basically your perception of each piece of ringing is massively affected by what's gone before. And so a team that's really quite decent ringing after a really bad team, the quality of the good team is sort of exaggerated somewhat by the contrast with the previous team and those sorts of things. So it's very important to, if you're judging using faults, to try really hard to remain consistent and to look out for the possibility that you might end up not giving very many faults to the teams at the end compared to the first team to ring. If it's quite a big competition and you can have some means of recording the ringing, that can be quite helpful as a way of then reviewing the earlier teams and just checking whether you might have been influenced by this effect, perhaps. So watching out for that and listening out for that is important as well. Then it comes to the stage where you've got your faults, you've added them up, you've therefore got an order of teams, hopefully you're in agreement with your fellow judges. If you're not, you might need to listen back to things, or if you haven't got recordings, you'll just need to argue it out. Get your order, and then you're going to want to write some comments, and hopefully you'll have made lots of notes earlier on in the day as you've gone through it. These comments are really important. It's, I think, important to be specific in terms of things to work on, but to balance that with being kind and not insulting and belittling the efforts of the bands that they've gone to. So comments which have been heard at the 12 Bell in the past are things like, this band would benefit from going back to their home tower and practicing Plain Hunt, I think was said at an eliminator a few years ago. That's generally to be avoided. Singling out specific bells for criticism, I think, is to be avoided as well. Because it's not kind, it's not really necessary. And if it was one bell that was causing a particular problem but everyone else was okay, it's quite likely that the band will know that already, to be honest, and will be able to work on that. So I don't think picking out particular individual bells is helpful. I think being positive and framing everything positively, so making sure you've got some good features that you can talk about. Made a good start, finished well, had a good overall rhythm, leading was good, the little bells were rung very well, tenor was rung particularly well, that sort of thing. And then specific things to work on, practice the leading to make sure that the hand stroke gap is consistent, focus on accuracy of the dodging, make sure the change doesn't stretch out at the back. Those sorts of comments that are specific and actionable, but not mean, really, I think are useful. So delivering those comments, it's a bit scary. You've got a big hall or church full of people all listening to you as the fount of all wisdom about how they've rung, so it's a bit scary. But delivering those comments to the band and then delivering the results. Think a bit about what the competition organisers want from that. So usually it's in reverse order, but there might be circumstances in which you might give a slightly different order. But usually it's reverse order, so the lowest ranked team upwards. You'll give the faults as you go. On that note, it's worth emphasising, if you've taken the being quite harsh approach in terms of judging, it's probably worth just fudging that a little bit so that you're not having to say, and team E in 6th place with 500 faults, because that's somewhat dispiriting. So if you've got, like, everyone's in the hundreds for your faults, you might want to divide it by 10 perhaps, to give it a slightly more acceptable spin on it. Though having said that, when you say and band G1 with 5 faults, it always sounds a bit unlikely. So have a think about that. Give the results in reverse order. Think a bit about the suspense. You might want to go, and in 2nd place with, and really slow it down if you want to really stretch out the suspense on that, perhaps. Like I said, I've not talked about everything to do with judging. There's lots of other things. So I'm just going to show you some further resources that you could use to get to, to have another look at this in a bit more detail. And I'll actually show you these on here. So I'm not the first person to think of doing a talk about striking competitions. Cambridge District got there first. If you haven't listened to any of these, they're absolutely excellent. Really good webinars that have been organised in the Ely Association are on a range of different things, blue lines, composition. And Katie Town delivered an excellent talk on striking competitions, so and goes into lots more detail and explains it all far better than I have today. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested in judging, to check out that talk by Katie Town, and I'll send around the link later. Essential reading, if you're interested in judging your first striking competition, is getting hold of a copy of Simon Linford's book on judging striking competitions. It really takes you through the whole thing, I think, and would be well worth getting. Again, I'm sure he's explained it much better than I have. I hate to be a person who references their own work But I wrote an article when I was chief judge for the 2017 12 bell, which was in the ringing world, and is about how the 12 bell gets judged these days. If you're interested in that side of things, it's probably worth looking at, even if I say so myself. I mentioned some articles by Liz Orme and Katrina Shearer. These were in the ringing world towards the end of 2018. This was the first one. This is the one where Liz establishes that idea about serial order effect, and is fascinating. It's very mathematical, but absolutely fascinating. And last summer, Simon Linford again wrote a kind of user-friendly guide to those articles by Liz, talking about basically each of the lessons. And this is his one where he talks about serial order effect and what that means. So yeah, so there are some further resources to check out if you wish to do so.